Angela Constance, the new Act was introduced only last week, and already we're hearing that Police Scotland have been overwhelmed. Was that not entirely predictable?
Well, in my engagement with Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Association, I think we all expected a busy few weeks in the early days of the implementation of this new legislation. It is important that I put on record that I continue to engage with Police Scotland, who tell me that, yes, they're having to invest additional resource in managing a heightened number of complaints, but nonetheless that they continue to cope and that additional demands are not having an impact on frontline community services.
That's exactly the opposite of what the Police Federation Scotland, the frontline officers, are saying. They're saying, A, they haven't been properly trained, B, there's a lot of overtime being involved in this, and that is going to impact frontline services, if not now, certainly later in the year. Well,
certainly the most recent communication I had with the Deputy Chief Constable last night, I certainly found reassuring in terms that the service was indeed coping. As I've said, I will continue to engage with all our Police Scotland family, whether that's the staff associations or the Scottish Police Federation.
On that point then, do you think a lot of the initial complaints were vexatious? What kind of percentage of them do you think might have been?
I think it's common sense to reflect that there's been a number of vexatious complaints. Of course, Police Scotland are well adept to dealing with new legislation and indeed with vexatious complaints.
And does this legislation not contribute to that, make that easier?
No, actually, I would dispute that. I mean, there is a very high threshold for criminality in this legislation, and we should also all remember, and this is an appeal to politicians and the public at large, the fundamental purpose of this legislation is to protect individuals, to protect communities who are vulnerable to the risk of hate crime. And at the end of the day, while people will have their views, it's legitimate to debate any legislation, but this legislation was passed by Parliament. 82 out of 129 parliamentarians voted for this legislation in the belief that it was the best way forward to protect communities at risk of hate crime.
But your own SNP colleague Joanna Cherry predicted it would be weaponised, as she said. I mean, you could have seen that, could you not?
So, and I think this is why, whether it was the Scottish Government or indeed Police Scotland, we anticipated an elevated amount of interest as the bill was implemented. We will continue to monitor the situation very, very closely, but it is important for me to stick to the facts that this legislation is about protecting people at risk of hate crime, but it also embedded within the Act in numerous ways, in numerous lines of legislation, is that protection for freedom of information, freedom of expression. Why
was this legislation required then, given that we already had the Public Order Act of 1986, which covered most of this?
So actually, what we should remember, John, is that the roots of this legislation is in the Bracadale Review, and while offences such as aggravations as a result of hatred and prejudice are not new to Scottish legislation, there was a very strong feeling and a view that Police Scotland shared at the time with the Justice Committee that there was a need for legislation to be codified, to be simplified, to be brought into the one legislative framework in terms of simplicity and to aid understanding. And also, if I go back to Lord Bracadale's review, he also pointed to the potential consequences of prejudice and hatred and how that can be used to escalate harm and violence.
But that wasn't covered by the Public Order Act 1986. That wasn't covered.
So the consensus at the time, and this was thoroughly explored in the Bracadale review, is that our legislation was quite unwieldy. There were different bits of legislation that covered different aspects of the law. There was a desire to codify and bring into the one piece of legislation to assist understanding.
But it doesn't include women.
No, and I look forward to bringing forward the misogyny bill later this year. There are, of course, general laws that are used day in, day out to protect women, but there will be very specific standalone legislation covering offences associated with misogyny. And
so when will the Scottish Government introduce that legislation?
So that will be this year. I'm in the process of some of the final policy deliberations. We have consulted on draft legislative provisions. We are giving further thought to those responses that we received to the consultation, and we are in the final stages of bringing forward a bill that will be introduced to Parliament this year. It's also important to say, John, that the findings of the Baroness Kennedy Working Group supported standalone legislation, because it was indeed an option to include misogyny within the original hate crime legislation of a few years ago. But her recommendation was rooted in the fact that women's experience of hate crime is amplified by misogyny. And bearing in mind we are 51% of the population, I think that merits standalone legislation. You
talk about being in close contact with Police Scotland. What did you make of their hate monster promotion?
Well, I only seen that promotion probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. I know it's a piece of old campaign publicity material that dates back to a year. Well, I mean, I think given my experience in government, one of the things I would reflect on is that public information campaigns can be fraught with difficulty. Sometimes, you know, they are a resounding success, and other times, well, let me be positive. So the campaigns that Police Scotland, in my view, that have been exceptional has been the Don't Be That Guy campaign.
Yes, but this one, the hate monster.
Well, I mean, didn't particularly appeal to me, but I would also point to the excellent work that Police Scotland have done in terms of senior police officers speaking direct to the camera, giving reassuring messages about what hate crime is and what hate crime isn't, and that it shouldn't be tolerated in this country.
You spoke about the number of vexatious claims that have been made already, and you anticipated that, and some of that may continue. What do you say to people who ultimately, because they're a high bar, we hear there's such a high bar in this, people who ultimately won't be charged, but who in the period in between might be very anxious about having been reported? What do you say to them to give them some reassurance?
Well, I think there's a lot we can say to reassure people in Scotland that, as you say, John, there is a very high threshold of criminality in this legislation. This legislation
but
was
during that period when they've been reported and whether a decision on whether any criminal act is to be pursued, that's a very anxious period. How do you reassure them?
Well, I would say to people in this country that they should have faith in Police Scotland to investigate all matters fearlessly and without favour to any interested party.
At a time of a cost of living crisis, falling education results, record drug deaths, extended NHS waiting times, is this really what the Scottish public want their government to be introducing? Should the focus not be on these day-to-day issues?
Why would the people of Scotland not expect their government to stand up for victims of crime? And victims of crime also includes people who have been harmed, life-changing impact of hate crime. I think people are well within their right to expect their government to be standing up to hate crimes. And we are standing up to hate crimes, but we are also protecting freedom of expression.
How will you judge the success or otherwise of this legislation?
Listen, it is early days with the implementation of this new legislation. You know, I've been around Parliament long enough to recognise that, you know, sometimes we need to do a bit more, work a bit harder to communicate what any given piece of legislation is about, or more importantly, what it is not about. So how will you judge success? Well, we will continue to build a safer Scotland, and we will continue to build consensus. I'm determined to build consensus, particularly as we move forward with the misogyny bill. Is there anything we can judge it on? This has been a success or a failure? Well, I mean, ultimately it will be whether people feel safer in communities. Ultimately, we will see cases being prosecuted and pursued through the courts. But ultimately, it is for the people of Scotland to know that their government takes all forms of crime very seriously and very seriously indeed.
Angela Constance, thanks for joining us, Scotland.
Thank you.